皆さんこんにちは。デニスと申します。これは初めての動画です。
楽しみにしています。
では、始めましょう。Hello folks, my name is Dennis, and as you can hear from my accent, I'm from Canada. Now that's not how I talk, but I am indeed from Canada, the French-speaking part of Canada, Montreal, Quebec. Ah ben oui, je suis québécois tabarnak. C'est vrai. And I've been wanting to make this video for a long time. It's my first video on my brand new channel dedicated to Japanese learning. And I was inspired by a YouTuber by the name of The Immersion Guy to make this video. So thank you so very much to you if you're watching this. All right, let's get started. Please like, please subscribe. In another life, I am a musician. And if you want to support me, well, of course, you can like and subscribe and all that stuff. Leave a comment, but you can maybe even buy some of my music. I'll put a link in the description box. Thank you so much. I guess in the next video, I'll do a self-introduction video, talk about myself, about my journey, how I learned, how I'm learning, and all that stuff. But this video is going to be about how the Japanese language actually works, the way real Japanese people speak. This is rarely taught in Japanese schools by Japanese teachers, even if they've had certification to teach Japanese. If you're seriously contemplating learning Japanese, or you're learning Japanese, or even if you're just curious, this video, I think, is the key to maximizing your efficiency in your Japanese studies. And it's going to be very comprehensive, and it might take a while to digest everything. In fact, I would suggest that you watch this video multiple times across your journey. If you're just starting out, just watch this. Try to just get what you can. 3 months, maybe 5 months later, watch it again. And then maybe some things will make sense. You'll be like, oh my gosh, now I finally understand what he meant. So a few points that I need to make. First is that this is coming from the perspective of someone coming from what they call an Indo-European language background. These are new words for me, these technical terms. I'll try to minimize the use of technical terms, but Indo-European language would be something like English. As I said earlier, I speak English and French natively, and I speak a number of other languages as well. I'll talk about that in another video. But this is very important. If you're coming from another language, it might still make sense, but for all intents and purposes, this is coming from the perspective of an English or French or German or Spanish speaker, something along those lines, because we will be talking about cultural differences. The cultural differences play a big role in how the Japanese language works, and it's important to understand the differences between how Japanese works culturally and linguistically, and then how the other languages work, namely English, French, etc. You will understand why, in general, the Japanese tend to behave a certain way. It has to do with the language. The language is heavily influenced by the culture, and vice versa. The culture is heavily influenced by the language. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. In order to understand how the language works, you need to understand the culture. Vice versa. In order to understand the culture, you need to understand how the language works. All right, let's get to the fun stuff. There are many things that make the Japanese language unique and so different from English. How the language works, as I said, itself is directly tied to their identity, their culture, and their mannerisms. The written portion of the language also greatly affects their identity and culture. Whether one chooses to use kanji or hiragana to spell a word can convey very deep implicit meanings and reveal a lot about a person's intent and emotions. Now, if you don't know what kanji and hiragana mean, don't worry, I'll explain later. Another way that the writing influences the culture and identity is the fact that sounds that are used in the language are actually very limited. They're almost like a very limited set of Lego blocks that you can use to construct words. So many words have the exact same Lego blocks, so to speak, meaning that they sound exactly the same. Now, there's something also called a pitch accent that can also help differentiate the meaning. For example, hashi, hashi, hashi in the Tokyo dialect means chopsticks. And then hashi, depending on which particle you use after, can mean different things, but generally most people will mean bridge. Hashi, hashi. But then you have Lego blocks, sounds that have the exact same pitch accent. Hana, hana, nose, or flower. And I mentioned particles earlier. You don't have to know what that means, but hana ga hana ga. That's how you differentiate between nose and flower. Hana ga, nose, hana ga, flower. Generally speaking, Japanese names are also constructed with kanji, which are Chinese characters, symbols that have implied meanings and various readings. A common name like Keiko can be written in a number of different ways. And when Japanese people introduce their names, they might explain the spelling of the kanji. So something that often occurs in the Japanese language when Japanese are having conversations, and sometimes they use a word, a certain sound, but the meaning is not so clear, they will explain the spelling, the kanji, and that's how they can tell, oh, this is what I meant. Most of the time, though, the context of the conversation will help differentiate the meanings. But sometimes they do this. Like, oh, sorry, what did you mean by this word? Oh, I mean this kanji. And then you have these words or set of words that are very, very common that you hear all the time. And you might be taught a grammatical explanation for that word or set of words. Something, for example, like ga. And your teacher might tell you that it's one way to say, but. お肉が好きですが、最近あまり食べてないです。I like meat, but lately I haven't been eating it. So in this sentence, I use the sound ga twice, but they serve two different grammatical functions. And that's just one small example. There are tons and tons and tons of little words like this, and you may be introduced to it in your lessons, and you think, oh, okay, so that's how it works. But then you encounter another sentence that has the exact same sound, so to speak, but it's a completely different grammatical function. Be very, very aware of this. Keep your mind very open. If you are just starting to learn Japanese, you may be tempted to only learn to speak first, or maybe just use Romaji, which is the Latin alphabet to write Japanese. And I think that's fine. It depends on the person. That's how I started, actually, and it served its purpose really well. But at one point, you absolutely need to start learning kanji and the kana, hiragana and katakana. And learning it will help tremendously in the speaking as well. As I said earlier, a lot of Japanese, when they're speaking, they have this visual imagery of the words in their head, the kanji. The writing/reading and the speaking are intimately intertwined. They're very, very connected in that way. For now, let's move on to another topic about how the language actually works. The Japanese language is highly contextual and it involves reading the air, so to speak. In fact, it's a very common Japanese expression, reading the air. 空気を読む. Personally, for me, from a psychological perspective, this is very, very fascinating. There are actually a lot of documentaries on this aspect of the language when it comes to people who are on the spectrum. People who are on the spectrum may potentially have trouble with reading the air, and it's very fascinating. It is said that Japanese is a highly passive language, and one could argue that the language itself is actually very passive-aggressive. There's a common stereotype that the Kyoto dialect is especially like this. One common stereotype or joke is that when a Kyoto person says, "Would you like more tea?" it basically means, when are you going home? Or let's say you have a piano at home and your neighbor shows up and says, "Wow, you're getting better at the piano." It actually means, I can hear you, you play too loud, please stop playing. So this is a great example of what I said earlier, how culture affects the language or language affects the culture. Chicken and egg thing. I'd like to share with you a personal story and anecdote. As I said, I'm a musician. And one time, a musician friend of mine was on tour in Japan. And one of his bandmates had a violin for sale. So they walk into a violin shop that actually apparently does potentially purchase used instruments. And they ask the guy, "We have this old violin. Would you potentially be interested in it?" Now, the shopkeeper didn't want it. But because of how the culture of the language works, the shopkeeper couldn't say no. So there was this kind of awkwardness. The shopkeeper was kind of like, until my friend, who happens to be blind, but he could read the air, he said, "You're saying that right now you're unable to purchase it, right?" To which the shopkeeper said, yes. See how passive it is? Here's a more common example of how the passiveness of the language works. Let's say you walk into a store and you're looking for something. What's very common to say in Japanese is, I'm looking for this, but, and then you read the air. It's very, very common. It's weird, but that's actually how the Japanese language works. It's very, very natural. I like to buy this, but I like to make a reservation, but in fact, yesterday I was at the airport and my friend wanted me to buy some duty-free cigarettes for him. Since I don't smoke, I didn't know how to look for exactly what he was looking for. So I asked the staff, あ、すみません。これを探しているんですけど. Excuse me, I'm looking for this, but... And then the shopkeeper understood, I know where it is. A few more examples to show just how widespread this passiveness is and how important it is. Let's say you want to talk to someone. You don't directly tell a person, I need to talk to you. You have to use another approach. You would say, ちょっといいですか? Literally, it means a little bit, please. Kind of like a little bit of your time, please. It's not direct, right? There are so many examples like this. I'll stop here and we can make another video where I really go in depth about this. But as I said, I'm a musician. Sometimes when I travel to different cities, not that I'm famous, but sometimes not musicians, but people do actually recognize me on the streets. And only in Japan has something like this ever happened to me. They're very afraid to speak to me. And if they do find the courage to speak to me, they are so hesitant. Like, I'm so very sorry for bothering you, but are you by any chance Dennis Chang? Yes, I am. And then they're like, I'm very sorry for bothering you. And then they run away. It is so weird. But that's how very passive they are. It affects their behavior. In other countries, it'll be like, hey, are you Dennis Chang? Hey, Dennis Chang. What's up, man? And they'll start talking to me and blah, blah, blah. We'll have a conversation and that'll be that. Not in Japan. So this leads me to the next topic, the cultural context of the language. Japanese is one of the hardest languages to translate because of the contextual aspect of the language. Even a simple translation like, where is the bathroom, is not possible to accurately translate. Now, I know your teacher may have taught you this or that, but again, most schools, teachers are not teaching the real Japanese because that's just not how the Japanese language works. If you want to know how to ask, where is the bathroom, I would have to ask you, who are you talking to? What are you in relation to this person? Is this person a stranger? Is this person a person who should know where the bathroom is? Is this person a friend? Someone older than you, your boss, etc. That will determine how you ask that question. It is so highly contextual. Most teachers will probably tell you, トイレはどこですか? That's the direct translation of, where's the toilet? But you will rarely hear this form. I mean, you can hear it, and some people will use it, but depending on the context, it can be considered too direct. Now, of course, there are some Japanese people who are very, very direct. There are not very Japanese-like. Such people do exist, but they are the exception and not the norm. A little side note, people in Osaka, in the Kansai region of Japan, are known to be a little bit more direct than their Japanese counterparts. So if you were to hear something direct like that, you might actually hear that in Osaka. All this to say that if you want to learn correct Japanese and not sound impolite, if you're taking classes with a teacher or whatever, and you want to learn how to say something, you must make sure to ask your teacher, is this appropriate to say in X or Y situation? Be sure to insist on that. Only then will the teacher maybe say, oh yeah, actually in this situation, maybe you should say it like this or like that. Let's use that toilet example, because I like bathroom humor. So in Japanese, there are a few ways to say toilet. Two of the common ways are toire, which is the katakana approximation of toilet. Or there's a more formal word, otearai. So let's say you're talking to a stranger. You want to know if there are any toilets around the area. You just don't know. So you talk to a stranger. And this stranger is just a random person, a civilian, not a store employee or anything like that. You can ask them,
すみません、兄ちゃん。
この近くにお手洗いがあるかご存知ですか? So hopefully you're from an English-speaking country because you'll know that the first part was just me trolling. Don't ever say
すみません、兄ちゃん。
unless you're in the right context. Now let's say you're talking to a buddy of yours. You can maybe say トイレどこにあるか知ってる? There are so many ways that you can express yourself. It's not like there's only one single way. But let's say you're talking to a store employee. You can maybe say, あ、すみません、お手洗いはすみません、トイレは If you want to be a little bit more polite, just a little bit, you can use お手洗い. But it's not like トイレ is impolite or anything. It's just a little bit, like maybe 5% less. So it really depends on the person. You can even use a little bit more of a complete sentence like あ、すみません、お手洗いを探しているんですけど This is a bit of a longer sentence, so maybe just the shorter one would be better. But this last one kind of implies that it's hard to find. Kind of implies that. It's subtle and complex in that way, but how you choose to express yourself says quite a lot about your personality, your character, so to speak. The Japanese language and culture is so precise and calculated in that way. In fact, sometimes I speak to Japanese people who are trying to learn English or French or whatever, and when I always ask them, what do you think is the most difficult? One of the most common answers that I get, pretty much all the time actually, is, besides the pronunciation, is they're so afraid to make mistakes. Why are they afraid to make mistakes? It's not because of making a mistake per se, but because in Japanese, if you make a mistake, you can sound very, very rude, arrogant, or mean, etc. It can have a very, very bad image on you. And a lot of Japanese people, when they're speaking to English or French people, say, "Please forgive me if I make a mistake. I don't want to be rude. I'm not trying to be rude or anything." That's just how intense the language is. So if you have a Japanese teacher or you're taking classes and you want to learn to express yourself, you want to say something very precise, make sure to insist with your teacher that they teach you the contextual appropriate way to express yourself. Explain in great detail the context, and then ask them to teach you the most natural way to say whatever it is that you want to say. Because believe me, I've been in situations where I sounded mean without doing it on purpose. There's a difference between 邪魔します and 迷惑かけます. They kind of both mean something similar, roughly speaking, basically troubling someone. But you have to know when to use one or the other for the appropriate situation, because I've used one when I was supposed to use the other, and it created some awkward moments. The problem of being a serious learner of Japanese is that when a Japanese person sees that you're very serious about your studies, it's almost like there's an on and off switch. They will treat you like a kind of like a Japanese person, expecting you to know all the subtleties of Japanese language, even though you're still studying. And that was what happened with me. They thought I was being very intent on my use of the incorrect word. And boy, was that very awkward. So yes, I understand why Japanese people are so very afraid when they're learning English or French or whichever other language. I often have to assure them that it's nowhere near as strict as Japanese. That situation does occur in English or French or whatever other language, but it's much more subtle. And I don't want to turn this into a political thing, so let's avoid political talk here, but I have a very good analogy. Let's take this statement. All lives matter. Anyone from an English-speaking country will know how politically charged this is. And that is exactly how Japanese is times 1,000. Being very precise in your choice of words is so important. I remember one time I went to a restaurant with a friend, and I was just in the beginning stages of learning Japanese. And I asked the waitress, "What's good?" That's very, very bad. What you should ask is, "What's your recommendation?" Or as a musician, and you're trying to choose which songs to play, and your friend says, "I want to play this song." Now you can answer two ways. You can say, "I don't like this song, but we can do it." That is very, well, by Japanese standards, that is not good. If you want to say it the Japanese way, maybe you should say, "If you like the song, maybe we can do it." It's very, very passive aggressive, but that's the natural Japanese way. So you can see how these extreme subtleties affect the average Japanese person's behavior. It will explain a lot of the things that you might encounter when you have kind of a relationship with a Japanese person. Things that might surprise you, that may be even unpleasant. Which now leads us to the next topic, the hierarchy. Japan is extremely hierarchical. There are two concepts that I would like to explain. The first concept is the concept of uchi, soto. The next concept is honne tatemae. These are two very important concepts that have a tremendous impact on the language, how words are chosen, and how people behave. Okay, uchi and soto. Uchi means inside, soto means outside, as in or out. Are you part of the cool kids or not? You're in or out. And this will determine how you express yourself according to the situation, according to whether the person you're talking to is considered inside or outside your group. And then there's honne tatemae. Honne would be your true feelings. Tatemae would be the feelings that you repress and the choice of words you use to maintain harmony. Now, I don't want to sound negative, but I have to mention this. If a Japanese person watches this, I apologize, but there's this stereotype that I hear a lot. The Japanese people are fake or very childish when it comes to social interactions. And it has a lot to do with honne tatemae culture. So that example that I gave you earlier, let's say the musician, and someone says, I would like to play this song. And the tatemae way of saying would be, if you like this song, then we can play it. The implied meaning is, you don't like this song. You'd rather not do the song. The Japanese language is very scary, isn't it? Especially if you're coming from an Indo-European language. But believe me, even Chinese people or Koreans have a lot of trouble with the cultural aspects of Japanese as well. I have a lot of expat Korean and Chinese friends in Japan. Koreans and Chinese actually share quite a lot of similarity with Japanese, the whole East Asian Confucius culture, yet there are still these fundamental differences. Anyway, be aware that when you're studying Japanese and you want to speak it correctly and sound appropriate, you have to be aware of all these things. You have to choose your words very, very carefully and even use the grammar in the culturally appropriate way. Here's a very common mistake, for example. If you're an English speaker, you would probably say, do you want to go to the restaurant with me? It's very natural, right? Very polite, nothing wrong. But if you make a direct translation of this into Japanese, it is very impolite. 私とレストランに行きたいですか? Already, that's kind of weird. Because I'm a guy, and if I'm talking to a friend or potential friend, 私, which means I, me, is a little bit strange. What would be maybe more appropriate, just depends on the situation, would be boku. The whole pronoun thing is another topic. Maybe I won't talk about it here. I can talk about it in another video. So I should probably change watashi to boku. Boku to restaurant ni ikitai desu ka? But that's still unnatural and potentially offensive. The correct way to say, would you like to go to the restaurant with me, is to use the passive form, or not passive, but to be more indirect. And so you would say, will you not go to the restaurant with me? That is the correct, polite Japanese way. And you don't have to necessarily say, with me. You can say together. You can say, 一緒にレストランに行きませんか? So, very closely related to this concept of uchi soto and honne tatemae concept would be the different forms of speech in Japanese. Depending on who you ask, there may be 2 or 3 distinct categories. Here in this channel, I don't really care about technical terms or semantics in that way, but I will use the definition of 3 categories. First category would be casual speech. So when you talk to your close friends, family. Then there is formal speech that you would use with strangers or potential new friends that you're not necessarily close to yet. And the final category is when you're in a very formal situation, you're talking to a client or your boss, things like that. But the truth is, within these categories, you have lots of subcategories. Some have names. And then within these subcategories, you have even more subcategories. So it's very, very subtle and complex and multi-layered in that way. Hopefully, as my channel continues to grow, please like, please subscribe, please share. I can make dedicated videos on each of these different topics and go really in depth. But basically speaking, if you're learning Japanese, this is one of the biggest trouble areas for a lot of learners. With these three official categories of speech forms, it's almost as if you're learning three different languages, and you have to be careful not to confuse them. This whole aspect of the language, of the culture, the different speech forms, the inside, outside, the true feelings, and fake feelings are very, very complicated and multi-layered, and it can get very ambiguous. So let's say you have two people. They are classmates in, let's say, I don't know, university. And in that context, they can use a form of speech with each other. But let's say the same classmates, in another context, one of them is a judo teacher and the other one is that judo teacher's student. In that context, they could potentially use another form of speech. So again, I remind you, context is extremely, extremely important. If you want to speak correct Japanese, make sure that you insist with your teacher that they explain to you when it is appropriate to use whatever it is that they're teaching you. Sometimes, not sometimes, quite a lot of times, a lot of these Japanese classes are teaching unnatural Japanese because they're following a curriculum. They haven't really put much thought into the psychological aspect of this, because for a lot of them, it's been like this for generations, and they kind of take it for granted. It's something that they're only aware of subconsciously. I want to go back a little bit to that topic of passiveness, indirectness in Japanese speech. For example, let's say you ask, what's 2 plus 2? In English or in French or whatever, you would confidently say 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's a statement, it's a fact, you're sure of it. In Japanese, instead, you would say, I think 2 plus 2 is 4. I believe 2 plus 2 to be 4. 2 plus 2 might be 4. That would be the natural Japanese way of articulating one's thoughts. Even if they're sure, they use a very passive way of saying, an indirect way, almost to kind of like show themselves to be humble. The next statement I'm going to make might be a little bit controversial, or people might take it the wrong way. But the fact of the matter is, just like with any other language, to be honest, most people who speak Japanese natively don't really know their language very well. They just speak it naturally. And it would be the same for me in English and French. I went to French schools my whole life. I actually studied a lot of the grammar we have to, but I forgot practically everything. I just speak it naturally. It just comes out like that. That would be the same for your own native language, right? How many of you are really 100% sure about the grammatical rules of your language? Unless you majored in or you really took an interest in studying it, most people are not aware of such things. And so it is with Japanese. So I do have Japanese friends who are learning English or French, and sometimes I help them, and they would ask me, is what I'm saying correct? And the truth is, I'm not sure if it's correct or not. You would really have to ask a grammar expert. But I can tell you what sounds natural to my ears. And what sounds natural to my ears might also depend on the region. So I'm used to a North American background. They might speak a bit differently, I don't know, say in Australia. Same thing with French. I'm from Quebec, and certain things change according to the region. If you're from France or you're from Belgium or Switzerland, certain things change. For instance, in French, you have masculine and feminine words. In Quebec French, we say le gym, the gym. But in France, la gym. So the pronunciation changes a little bit, but in France, it's feminine. In Quebec, it's masculine. You have little things like this. If you want to live in Quebec for a long time, it's probably better to speak the Quebec way of speaking French, and therefore you would say le gym. But if you're living in Paris, maybe you should say la gym. So imagine you're living in Quebec, but you're taking French lessons from someone in France, and they tell you It's la gym, not le gym. I'm mentioning this because you have to be very careful when you're going to try to learn Japanese from a Japanese person. They might give you a lot of very bad advice. I've certainly received quite a lot of bad advice from average Japanese people, but also from teachers. Yes, certified teachers. In fact, I have many, many teachers. I've had up to 10 teachers going on at the same time, taking lessons every single day from different teachers. The reason for this is for that very reason. The fact that a lot of them speak naturally already, even if they have a certificate to teach. And then a lot of things will depend according to even the person. So it's good to get perspective from a whole bunch of different people. There's an expression in Japanese, Junin Toiro, literally 10 people, 10 colors. Maybe you can guess what it means. You ask 10 people, you get 10 different answers. I've been told by many Japanese people and teachers, oh, don't say this, it's not correct, or say it like this. And then I would hear another person say it the way that I had said it before, and then I got so confused. And that's why it's very important to get as many perspectives as possible, even if you have a certified Japanese teacher. I'll tell you what, I was in one classroom in Fukuoka, in the west coast of Japan, where I said 10分, which means 10 minutes. I didn't say that. Someone else said that, another classmate. And the teacher corrected that student. No, 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 not 10分, 10分, 10分. And I was so confused. I thought, oh, did I maybe learn it wrong when I was learning numbers? Now, it turns out you can say it both ways. But if you say 10分, it's kind of an older way of saying things. A lot of older people speak that way. And it so happens that that teacher was maybe in her 70s or 80s. So if you speak that way, you can potentially sound like an old person.
10分ではなくて10分ですね。
I have so many examples like this. I can make a list at some point in another video. But my whole point in making this video is not to trash talk anyone, but to make you aware of such things because it can get very, very confusing as a learner of Japanese. Believe me, because I've been in those shoes before. And that's why I'm making this video, so I can avoid you this pain, this confusion. You might be tempted to use apps like Hello Talk, which is a language exchange app, which I do use to write a diary, Dear Diary. But it's an app where people can correct what you write, but be very careful. I see a lot of very bad advice there and things that I question a lot. Luckily, I have a huge network of Japanese teachers and friends that I can ask to get all these different perspectives. That's why I'm sure of what I know. And the opposite is true as well. A lot of Japanese who are studying English and French, sometimes they get feedback from other English or French native speakers. And I really think the advice that they get is sometimes wrong or bad or very, very confusing. Because people who speak their mother tongue don't really know much about their mother tongue. Actually, I'll tell you one thing. My first language is not English, nor is it French. The first language I ever spoke was Taiwanese because my parents are from Taiwan. Apparently, Taiwanese is a tonal language. It has many tones, but I can't tell you what they are. I have no idea what the Taiwanese tones are. I watched a YouTube video of an American guy, a white American guy, explaining in fluent Taiwanese all the different tones, and I was so impressed. Sometimes it takes someone from an outside perspective to really break things down with the technical terms, so that you can make sense of what's going on. Of course, the best way to learn is naturally. That is the best way, but sometimes it's not possible, in which case you'll have to do a little bit of deconstruction. I really want to stress this statement that I just made. Re-listen to this as many times as you need to because it's very, very important. I've been held back by people who meant well, even people that I paid who gave me bad advice just because it's not their fault, because they're not, a lot of the things that they do is so subconscious, they've never really put any thought into it. Remember, there is the Japanese that they will maybe teach you from a textbook in schools or from a private teacher, and then there's real Japanese. Real Japanese might have all these inconsistencies. In fact, a lot of Japanese is actually quote unquote incorrect, but because it's used very often, it becomes natural. It's the correct way of speaking. Sometimes the officially correct way, the grammatically correct way, is unnatural. And this would be the same with any other language, like English or French. I want to give another example of this subconscious naturalness that Japanese people have that sometimes translates into confusing or, at worst, bad teaching. I ain't gonna be naming names, but there's a Japanese YouTuber who teaches pitch accent. And no, I'm not talking about Dogen. I'm talking about an actual Japanese person, native Japanese speaker. In this video, the YouTuber is correcting their students' pronunciation, namely their pitch accent, the student's pitch accent. And this teacher student is reading a text from a television news segment. So the teacher goes on to nitpick the student's pitch accent. And then the teacher says, if you want to get the correct pitch accent, copy the original news segment. And the teacher links the news segment. Now, if you watch this news segment, it can get very, very confusing because even though the news anchor is trying to use the Tokyo dialect, which is the standard dialect, this news anchor's accent, well, it's hard to tell exactly why. It could be a number of different reasons. It could be that this person might not be from Tokyo, and the accent that they had from wherever they're from accidentally crept into their news segment, which happens. So it was an accident, or this person might have habits, which we all do, or maybe that person just made a little mistake. It happens. But it's so very interesting that the YouTube teacher is suggesting that the students of Japanese mimic the news anchor who is using quote unquote incorrect pitch accent. In other words, the YouTuber, the teacher, was able to nitpick their students' pitch accent, but because the news anchor is Japanese, the teacher probably didn't even realize that the news anchor is using quote unquote incorrect pitch accent. So I was very, very intrigued by this. I decided to copy the news anchor's text on Hello Talk, and I used the correct Tokyo dialect. And I'm very sure of this because like I said, I asked many, many, many Tokyo native speakers, and I was able to average things out. I can talk about this really in detail because it's very fascinating, this experiment that I did. I will have to make a pitch accent video to really talk about this, but I'll just make it actually brief here. I used the Tokyo dialect, and then I got a feedback from this young person on Hello Talks like, oh, wow, you're studying pitch accent. That's so cool. Since you're asking me to nitpick, I will nitpick. And this is a very important point because I'm asking people to nitpick. It makes people think a different way. If I had not asked people to nitpick, maybe they wouldn't even notice anything. But this young person who tried to be helpful said, you pronounced kanto incorrectly. The correct pronunciation, according to the person, is kanto. But I'm 1000% sure that I'm right. According to the Tokyo dialect, it's kanto. I asked this young person, where are you from? And they said, I'm from Nagoya. So maybe in Nagoya they pronounce it that way, but in Tokyo it's kanto. And when I said that, they said, oh, I didn't know. Maybe you're right. Now, actually, it just so happens that the news anchor said kanto. So maybe that person is actually from Nagoya or one of those regions. Again, I did a very, very interesting experiment with that news segment, which I can share in another video. But if you're just curious, here's the original sentence. 今日は関東から東海にかけて雪が降っていて、内陸では10センチ前後の雪が積もっています。So this video is a broad overview of how the language works so that once you understand this, it can maybe make your studying a little bit easier to understand so you can ask the correct questions when you take lessons or if you take lessons. And even though this is a long video as it is already, I can go even more in depth with each topic. So the next thing I want to talk about is what I talked about earlier, is the writing system. So essentially you have 4 writing systems: kanji, hiragana, katakana, romaji. So as I said earlier, romaji is the Latin alphabet way of writing the Japanese language. So we're just going to discount that. We're just going to focus on kanji, hiragana, and katakana. So hiragana and katakana are basically the Japanese alphabet. I'll make a separate video about this, but they represent the Lego blocks that I talked to you about, the individual sounds. A, I, U, E, O, kakiku, keko, etc. In Japanese, it's called gojuon. That literally means 50 sounds or 50 tones. So hiragana and katakana make the exact same sounds. They're the exact same Lego building blocks, but they're used in different situations. There are actually exceptions, but generally speaking, hiragana is the standard, and katakana is used for loan words or to emphasize certain words. So a hiragana Lego building block or katakana building block in itself does not necessarily mean anything. It doesn't represent anything but a sound. Now, there is something to be said about the actual pronunciation of these hiraganas and katakanas. It's that it's not necessarily like an exact Lego building block where you preserve the sound of each letter. In fact, you'll see that the pronunciation changes depending on how you use each sound. So I'll have to make a dedicated video on Japanese pronunciation. Now, kanji is borrowed from the Chinese writing system, and it's a very vast and interesting topic. It's basically, if you will, a picture that symbolizes something. So, for example, this one symbolizes fire. This one symbolizes person. This one symbolizes heart. This one symbolizes water. Again, this is a huge topic, and I would have to make multiple dedicated videos talking about different aspects of kanji. What I want to do here is just give you an idea of how it works for learning purposes. Basically, there are no set rules. There's a subjective element to this, and people even debate about this. But some words are often written only in kanji, and some words often only in hiragana, and sometimes you can use one or the other. And this one or the other is where it gets subjective. Because if you write in hiragana, it gives off one image, usually a softer image. But if you choose to write it in kanji, it gives a more serious image. In other words, different factors can play a role in whether one chooses to spell things in kanji or in hiragana. Writing in kanji gives a little bit of a formal image or an idea that you're a little bit more sincere or serious. It shows a lot about your character and intent as well. For example, the most common one would be thank you, arigato. Generally speaking, most of the time it is written in hiragana only. But sometimes, to give more weight to the word, people will write it in kanji. And literally it means with difficulty. You have done something with difficulty. Therefore, I appreciate it. It's pretty rare, but I've met Japanese people who use the kanji version of arigato quite frequently, consistently. It's just a stylistic thing as well, so there's that possibility, hence the subjective nature of things. So my advice to you, just because it exists in kanji doesn't mean it's natural or that you should write it in kanji. You have to get the experience, the feel for when to use one or the other. You can ask your teachers, etc. Be aware of this. It's very important. The next thing I want to talk about would be vocabulary and how it relates to kanji. Generally speaking, the more kanji you use, the more formal it looks. And to put it another way, sometimes you can say the same thing in a whole bunch of different ways. In certain ways, involve using Chinese influenced words using kanji. For example, to use something in Japanese is tsukau, but there are other ways to express that sound more formal. Goryō. When to use these words, one or the other, or actually there are many words in many ways, really depends on what I said earlier, the context. It's all about context. And one thing that beginners are rarely taught is keigo, which is the business speech I told you about, the very super formal speech. This is considered quote unquote advanced Japanese, rarely taught to beginners. Yet, let's say you're saying, oh, I want to learn Japanese so I can get by as a tourist. They'll never teach you keigo in the beginning, yet this is what you need to learn how to understand in order to survive in Japan. Because when you go into a store, guess which language they will use? They will use keigo. And if you don't know how to understand keigo, you won't be able to know how to respond. You won't be able to use the basic Japanese that you know. Keigo is very, very important. It's vast, but luckily, as a tourist, you just have to understand the keigo that you're likely to encounter. So if you go to a restaurant, they'll ask like "nanmei sama desu ka?" Or if you go to the convenience store, they might say "reiji bukuro go ryo desu ka? Fukuro do saremasu ka?" All these kinds of there are tons of variations. There are different ways of expressing keigo. It depends on the individual. But this is something you really need to learn as a beginner if you just even want to learn tourist Japanese. Very important. And then it's very important to understand context, when to use these complex words and when not to use them. I mean, these complex words in themselves are not keigo, but they're often used alongside keigo. So I highly recommend that you constantly question yourself. Always ask about the context. I met at a language exchange a guy who spoke actually very good Japanese. And it's very impressive because this person learned on their own without a teacher. Yet, because they didn't have a teacher, didn't have the experience of getting feedback, they were using the words kind of in the wrong context, and it kind of sounds weird. For example, if you switch your phone to Japanese, you will often see this term, 入力. So this person thought that this was the word for typing, which it is, but it's kind of like the textbook way. You sound like a robot if you use it, depending on the situation too. But let's say you ask your friend, hey, can you type this for me? If you use 入力, it kind of sounds weird. You can just use a very simple word, which is 打つ. 打つ literally means to hit, to strike. But this is like in common speech, the word for typing. So that's an example of context. So obviously, quite a lot more can be said about how Japanese works, but I want to talk about the contextual, the behavioral, the cultural aspect of how the language works, because it is very, very rarely talked about. And if you're aware of such things, in my opinion, it will make the learning process a whole lot easier, because you can be always having this in the back of your mind, and you can always be asking the appropriate questions to your teachers. And maybe I'll make one video about how to take lessons from teachers, because I made that criticism that a lot of teachers, not all of course, but quite a lot of them really don't know their language that well as they think they do. And if that's the case, how can you learn from them? Yes, you can still learn from teachers who don't know what they're doing. You just have to know which questions to ask. So I can make a video about that. Please leave a comment. There we go. That was my very first video on this new channel. I'd really appreciate if you leave a comment, share, subscribe. And I gotta thank the immersion guy for giving me the inspiration to do this. So I guess in the next video, I'll be doing a self-introduction. See, I'm already behaving Japanese. I said, I think in the next video. In the past, I would have just said, in the next video. It's very Japanese. Let me tell you something. When you get into something really deep, it's going to change you. A lot of people have actually mentioned that I'm very different. Let me just share one more funny story. Very recently this year, my friend John from America came to Japan to visit a friend of his who had been living in Japan for a long time. And he invited me to join him. And after hanging out, we spent a whole day together. My friend John mentioned to me how much his friend had changed. Like he was kind of surprised. And it's very funny. It's as you learn the language and as you get closer to the culture, it's just gonna change you. For better or for worse, it's normal. So as I said, the language is tied to the culture is tied to the language. So besides just the language aspect of of Japan. If you guys are interested, I can talk about the cultural aspects as well, because I have quite a lot to say about that. Well, alright, fellas. I had quite a lot of fun. I hope you guys had fun too. See you in the next video.